It's 2:00. My name is Sarah Stalker, and I'm here to assist the moderator for today's Ontario Native Literacy Coalition webinar, Yuma Hester. And Yuma, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. And of course, the virtual hosting duties. My name is Yuma Hester. I am half Cree, half Anishinaabe. My father's side of the family comes from Moose Factory by way of Waskaganish in the James Bay. And my mother's side of the family comes from Nashingming up in the beautiful Georgian Bay. I wanted to welcome all of our esteemed participants, supporters, anybody tuning in today, whether you've been to our webinars in the past or this is your first time, welcome. Everybody is welcome here. So we will begin shortly here, but I wanted to take a few moments to do just a little bit of housekeeping. So the presentation will go for about 45 minutes and it'll be complete with a slide deck, and I'll be sharing my screen here in a moment for that. But if you have any questions, and I know I'm definitely going to, just please hold on to them until the end of the presentation. And if you can't, and if you have to write it down, feel free to write it in the chat feed in the dialog box, and I'll facilitate those at the end of the webinar. And Sarah and I were chatting a little bit before just about how it feels like collectively as a society we've had 7 months of Zoom training. So I hope everyone knows kind of where the dialogue box is and where to find those things are. If not, just reach out to Sarah, she can help you. So that's just a little bit about myself. Thank you very much again for joining us. And I wanted to introduce our first speaker. It's Satsan, otherwise known as Herb George, and he's a Wet'suwet'en Hereditary Chief from the Frog Clan and a longtime speaker for the Wet'suwet'en Nation. And he has over 40 years of experience working towards recognition and respect of the inherent rights to self-government in the courts, the classrooms, and communities. Today, Satsan is leading a collaboration between the Center, the Institute of Public Administration of Canada, and Carleton University's School of Public Policy and Administration, in the Transitional Governance project. And the project provides strategic direction and directs applied research and analysis to support First Nations governments who are working to leave behind the Indian Act administration. And with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Zuma, and welcome to everybody. I really appreciate this opportunity, and I want to thank Ontario Native Literacy for this chance to get the word out, I guess, to people on a grander scale. And I'm familiar with Contact North. I've had engagement with them in the past. So I'd just like to first of all introduce myself to people who are on. My name is Satsan. I'm from the Wet'suwet'en Nation. I'm from the Gisdayway clan, which is the Big Frog clan. My father clan is the Gidimdan, which is the Bear clan. And I come from a little village called Chekia, which translates into the houses, a village on the rocks. And I'm, of course, Wet'suwet'en. And I spent my young years, like most of our people, growing up on a reserve. For myself, being born into a time of total social chaos, at least that's the way I recall it and remember it. And as a young person, it caused many, many questions in my mind, and to witness the chaos and to wonder what is happening here to our people, and especially, my own family and my own parents. And I recall one day outside the back porch of my uncle's house, which was a kind of a refuge for me, and crying and thinking to myself, doesn't anybody love me? Doesn't anybody care? And making a pledge to myself at that very young age that I wasn't going to let this, whatever was happening, define who I was going to be and how I was going to get there. In other words, I'm not going to let this do the same thing to me. So this whole notion of, the colonization that happened to us was in my mind from a very young age because I questioned it all the way along. And of course, as a part of that, also went to residential school and continued there thinking about what's happened to us, and in the process of all of that, becoming a very, very angry person. And that anger kind of defined me, and it was like a blanket, a dark blanket on me all the time. And I came out of residential school, hitchhiked across the country, and I was lucky to go to the 6th annual Canadian Indian Youth Workshop, which was being held out of Sault Ste. Marie. And I got the chance to be with people who had a different mindset, who came at this from our spiritual origins, and we're continuing that. And one of those people, interestingly, Zuma, was from your country. Oh man, I can't even remember his name. It's been so long. But anyway, what it did was it transformed the way I thought, and it made me realize the notion of colonization. And it made me also realize that our ceremonies and our spirituality and our customs and our traditions were important, and we have to go back to that in order to deal with what has happened to us. So I went home from there in 1975 and encountered our hereditary chiefs, several who were there to welcome me home because of their relationship with my father. And then they told me that they needed help, my help. And I asked them, well, what can I do? I'm just a young person. And they said, well, you're educated, because you came out of grade 12. And what they were doing was taking a fight for the recognition of the title and rights in their lands and their inherent right to self-government. And I realized when I began that conversation and dialogue with them that this had been going on from the time of first contact with the settlers and then finally government in our territories. And it was my grandfather, Gouflet, who's one of our hereditary chiefs in my clan. That name still survives, it's still being held. And he was there when the McKenna-McBride Commission came to establish the reserves in our part of the world. And one of the things that he said to them was, you don't have any land to give me, so I don't understand what you're talking about. But if you want to talk how we can share with you, then I can do that. And of course, we all know what has happened. So I end up working with our hereditary chiefs and our people, and we end up taking a major title action to the courts, which began in 1986. And we came out of the Supreme Court of Canada December the 11th, 1997. And that court case was about seeking a declaration that initially that we have ownership and jurisdiction to our territories. And when we got into the courts, we based the case on our own history, our oral histories. We based the case and we brought it forward using our own language. And it was our hereditary chiefs and elders and people who were the expert witnesses for us. And we did it all in our own language. And we used our own history in our own governance systems and our own laws, our own customs and traditions to define who we are as a people. And we got into the Supreme Court of British Columbia, and we came out of there, we lost. The Chief Justice of the BC Supreme Court more or less said that as far as our oral histories were concerned, we had just made it up. And as far as having laws was concerned, he said at best all we had were customs. And so he more or less characterized us as an uncivilized people who couldn't have all those fineries of nationhood. And it was my job to bring that decision back to our people. And I remember the shock on the faces of our chiefs and our elders and people, because they believed that if we went into that court, which is a foreign court, and we told the truth, that truth would prevail. And they were shocked at the result. So we had to regroup and recoup, and we got back to getting busy, and our people, the rallying cry became, if we are not a people, and if we don't have a language, and we don't have a homeland, and we don't have a history, and we don't have a spirituality, then we must be invisible people. So if we are invisible people, then they can't see us as we reorganize to go into the BC Court of Appeal. And that was a rallying cry from our people. And that's the way we conducted ourselves, as if we couldn't be seen, that we weren't seen. So we went to the Court of Appeal, and we gained some ground there, and we got leave to appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada, where we ultimately ended up. And we came out of the Supreme Court of Canada December 11th, 1997, with the first legal recognition in Canadian history of the fact that Aboriginal title and rights to continue to exist and are in fact legal rights. We also went there to provide some of the earliest and first definitions of Section 35 of the Constitution Act, which was added in 1982, which recognizes and affirms existing Aboriginal and treaty rights. And we came out of the Supreme Court with a decision where the Supreme Court recognized that Aboriginal title and rights are recognized and protected under Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982. But the most important thing we went there looking for was the recognition of our oral histories as valid as anybody else's history in the world. Because we lost at the BC Supreme Court because the Chief Justice refused to accept our evidence, which was based on our oral history, because he characterized it as hearsay, and that it couldn't be, the truth and the reality of it couldn't be depended on. So that was the biggest thing for us. So we won this recognition, and then what I decided to do was I needed to get out there and get the word out. So I got elected as the regional chief for British Columbia to the Assembly of First Nation, and created the national process on Delgamuukw-Gisdayway, which was the name of our case. And what I was trying to do there was to get the word out to our people across the country that we have won the recognition that we've been fighting for since the time of Confederation. And now it was time to turn inward to our people to reorganize and to start to implement our rights and to put back in place our inherent right to self-government. And I created the National Center on First Nations Governance to support that work in the community, on the ground, amongst our people where they live. And after a lot of time in the communities and the National Center being ended and creating the new center, the Center for First Nations Governance, one of the things that perplexed me was, where are the people? man, we've been fighting for this recognition for so long, every which way possible. You know, we had great, great leaders of the past who kept this fight alive and carried it forward. And then we were successful. And it seemed like no one was standing up. And I wondered, like, what's going on here? There's something wrong with this picture. So when I was doing the work with the National Center on First Nations Governance, I put together a research project on getting out of the Indian Act. And one of the papers was, using our own law to get out of the Indian Act. And it was written by Professor John Burroughs, who's now at the University of Victoria Law School, and who's also an Anishinaabe. And he wrote a paper called 7 Generations, 7 Teachings, using our own law to get out of the Indian Act. And in his paper, he realizes that this is personal. And he looks at his own family's experience and relationship under the Indian Act and the reserve system. And he realized that he was the 6th generation and that his children were now the 7th generation. So I went back to that and I realized, that's how long our people have been colonized and oppressed under the Indian Act and continuing to be suppressed there. And, Aboriginal title and treaty rights and the inherent rights to self-government is not on the top of their minds because they're trying to survive. And under the Indian Act, there's not one word in it which says that, the council needs to be accountable to the people. So consequently, they've been left out. And I realized that we got to get to the people and we got to start talking about just what our inherent right to self-government is. And we need to look at it from the time that we've had it for these thousands of years. We need to look at the history of it in terms of our time in Canada. And we need to look at the fact that we've regained the recognition that we need to move forward. So I have to rethink my whole approach. And what I came up with was this notion of transformational governance, and that we need to begin with the people, and we can't make any assumptions about what they know or don't know. And if we're going to do anything with our inherent right, then that decision has to be made by the rights holders, who are the people. So what I'd like to do now is to take you through, just an approach that we've developed based on our experience on the ground. And it's been tested and proven to work. And we're constantly upgrading and improving it as we learn more in the community. So I'd like to take you through this now, and it's about transformational governance. In other words, we need to transform ourselves out of and away from the Indian Act, back into our own place, under our own governance, under our own law, within our own homeland. And so what I want to go through are the transitional steps to implement the inherent right to self-government. Okay, Yuma, the next slide, please. So one thing we need to always keep in mind that, for thousands of years, the Aboriginal peoples of what now Canada organized themselves as sovereign nations with what was essentially governmental jurisdiction over their lands, including property rights. And those rights of governance and property were trampled in the stampede of European settlement, colonization, and commercial interests, but they were never lost or extinguished. And this is a quote from Kent McNeil, who is one of the premier experts on Section 35 of the Constitution Act and Aboriginal Title and Treaty rights. And so that's really important for us to begin with, that we've been here for thousands of years. And in fact, in our evidence in our court case, through carbon dating, we know as Wet'suwet'en people that we've been on our lands for in excess of 10,000 years. Okay, Yuma, thank you. Next. So in terms of the inherent right, when I realized we had to change our approach, I went out talking to elders and leaders across the country, because we started to use the inherent right as almost political rhetoric. We have the inherent right to self-government, because that's what the leaders of the past, our great leaders, were fighting for. But we had forgotten the meaning of it. So when I went to start talking to people and saying, what is it? I couldn't get a clear definition really from anyone. So what we did was we looked back on the history of our struggle for recognition from coast to coast to coast in this country of our great leaders. And what we found was they were talking essentially about 5 things. First of all, they were talking about our inherent right as a people. Secondly, they were talking about our inherent right as it relates to the lands, our territories. Thirdly, they were talking about our inherent right as it relates to our jurisdiction and laws. They were also talking about our inherent right as it relates to our governing institutions, our governance systems. They were talking about our inherent right as it relates to our resources, which is, we look at in 2 ways. One, the people resource that we need to not only conduct ourselves that way, but to govern ourselves that way. And secondly, the resources of the land that we use to look after our people and to create an economy. So those form what we refer to as the 5 pillars of our inherent right to self-government. And it's based upon our land, our language, our history, and our spirituality. Those 4 things which define us as nations, for me as Wet'suwet'en people, for Mohawks as Mohawk people, for Haidas as Haida people. We all have those things in common, but they are also different. But those 4 things define who we are as a nation and as a people. So the first exercise that we conduct when we enter into a community, and we go into a community where the leadership has already made a decision that we need to move out of this oppressive Indian Act back into the realm of our own inherent right to self-government, so that we can better the lives of our people, rebuild the health and well-being of our people and our communities and our nations, and to have and create a new relationship with Canada. So what we do here is we go back in our own memory. So we bring together the people, and we start off by explaining to them the notion of these 5 pillars of the inherent right. And we say we have to self-define that for ourselves. So the approach that we use is to use open space facilitation, which is a style of facilitation where we're not coming there with a decision that we've already made and looking for people to agree with it, but rather we're coming in there for the people to determine their own agenda, based on their own vision and their own priorities. In other words, to empower them to act for themselves. So what we do here is we go back and we say, do you remember in your history when the first settler arrived on your territories? And almost everywhere we go, people remember the exact date, some of them the time of day, and in one instance, the fact that this person was riding a mule. And the reason why that memory is so strong is because it's had such a devastating effect and impact on us. So people set that date, and I say, okay, let's take our memory the day before those settlers arrived, and let's talk about who we are as a people. And what comes out of there is the people themselves start to say, we were citizens of our own nations. We had our own histories. We had our own language. We had our own spirituality. We had our own traditions and customs. You know, we had leaders in many different places because we needed many different leaders. We had experts in different areas. We had specialists. You know, we had our own warriors. We had our own doctors. We had everything. And when it comes to the land, the people say we had our territories and our boundaries were defined, and we protected those lands. And we have a responsibility and an obligation handed down to us by the Creator to look after the land and all the living beings that are on it. And that obligation and responsibility is our inheritance, and we need to pass that on to future generations. And then they'll talk about the fact that our history comes from the land, that our language comes from the land, that our spiritual practices come from the land, our culture, our traditions, and that the land is living, it's a living spirit, and that we are a part of that, and we have obligations and responsibilities. And they'll go on and literally will cover the walls. And when it comes to jurisdiction and laws, people will start to remember in their language that we had trespass laws, for example. We had laws that relate to the way we conduct ourselves with one another as people. We had laws that relate to the land in terms of how we conduct ourselves with the land and all the living beings on it. And we have principles and values that guide the way we use the lands and resources to look after ourselves. And they'll go on and on. And when it comes to governance, people remember their own governing systems. And on the West Coast, it's a longhouse culture. That's my culture. We have clans, we potlatch. And as you go eastward, it changes to where you have clans and family head systems, and then you have different systems, family head systems, and then you encounter the clan system again the further you go east. So right across the country, everybody remembers and knows that we had our own governing systems, and we had our own institutions of governance. And we exercised governmental authority over our territories and amongst our people. And that really becomes an amazing discussion. And what comes out of this is the fact that people realize that if we're going to remember this in all its glory, then no one person has all that knowledge and remembrance. And people realize that we have to activate collective memory, and that language becomes critical and crucial to this. And so that's when we begin to see the people coming together, sharing their knowledge, bringing the language forward, and in the process, teaching others. And then it comes to the resources that we required. People say, in our traditional systems, we had many, many leaders because we needed different leaders to do different things. And we had our specialists and experts, everything that we needed. And as far as the resources of the lands, we had strict laws and principles and values that determine our conduct. We can't manage it, but we can manage our conduct. So what happens as a result of this is the people will self-define who they are as a people. And they'll bring back the memory of their territories and how they used it and their place on the land and the way it reflects on everything about who they are. and laws and jurisdiction, governance systems and resources. And when we get through that process, people are so empowered, they're so happy, you know. And then we take them to the next step, which is to look at the history of our inherent right in Canada. So, Yuma, if you take me to the next slide, please. So basically, the next part of this scope and sequencing of our work in the community is the origin and content of the Indian Act, because that's our reality as Aboriginal Indigenous people in this country. And so what we'll look at here in this part of the workshop is what happened to the inherent right. We'll look at the history of the inherent right to self-government in Canada, and we'll begin with the people. When was contact and when did the Indian Act first come to you and your nation? And through that process, we'll educate people about the fact so that they understand why there's this culture of distrust, why we have all this conflict in the community amongst ourselves, the anger, and the fact that we need to reconcile amongst ourselves in order to move from this place. So what we're looking at here is the impacts of settlement, colonization, and Confederation and the Indian Act. Okay, Zuma? So we begin here by educating our people who, for the most part, didn't know that the Indian Act was designed prior to Confederation, that it was willful in its intent, which was to exterminate our people, and later their stated policy objective became to assimilate our people. And our people have no idea in their memory, because no one's taught them this, about how this came to be and how this impacted their lives to such a desperate degree. So we begin with the fact that at 1755, the British Crown establishes the first Indian Department. And at that time, the relationship between our nations and the British Crown, and any other crown for that matter, was nation to nation. And our relationship with both the French and the English in our history was as allies, military alliances. So the relationship was very, very different at that time. And that's what that was what this Indian Department that the British Crown established was based on. And of course, we know through history that the war between the British and the French carried on to the point where the British felt that they had won and were victorious, and they issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And the Royal Proclamation did a couple of things. It was the first formal assertion by the British Crown over jurisdiction over Indians and Indian lands. So in some respects, people view the Royal Proclamation as the first recognition of Aboriginal title and rights. And we could argue, yes, it was. But on the other hand, it also asserted their own jurisdiction to that, and it came up with this principle that nobody can deal with Aboriginal lands except the Crown. In other words, we can't sell or cede or surrender to anybody else but the British Crown. The Royal Proclamation also established the formal treaty process that we've all come to know in the Atlantic with the peace and friendship treaties. And as we move westward, the Robinson-Huron treaties, the numbered treaties that go right into British Columbia. And so that all came about from the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And what our people don't realize with that there were a series of laws and policies prior to Confederation that came into being, starting in 1850, where you have the first legal definition of Indians and Indian lands. And I'm going to have to rely on my notes here because this is important. So basically, there were two acts that are important here. One was the Act for the Better Protection of the Lands and Property of Indians in Lower Canada, which is now the area known as Southern Quebec. And what that act did was it established a commissioner to hold lands in trust for the Aboriginal people, but with the full power to do what he wished. So this was the first birth, I guess you would say, of the Indian agent and the Minister of Indian Affairs. At the same time, there was an act for the protection of Indians in Upper Canada, which is now the southern part of Ontario, from imposition and property occupied or enjoyed by them from trespass and injury. And what that act underlined was the fact that it's only the Crown that can deal with Indians and Indian lands. And so what comes out of these two acts was the first definition of who was or who was not an Indian. So it's the first legal definition of Indians and Indian lands. And this is where you get the notion of reserves starting to come into the picture and into the language. And in 1857, we have an act to encourage the gradual civilization of Indian tribes and to amend the law relating to Indians. It's also known as the Gradual Civilization Act. And we know that when the Crown and the colonizers, settlers first came into our world and our country, that they came here under the doctrine of discovery and the doctrine of terra nullius, which was that we're uncivilized people. And so as uncivilized people, we're not human beings. And so if we're uncivilized people and we're not human beings, then the land was deemed to be empty and that they can just come and take it. So this act, which is known as the Gradual Civilization Act, is based on that notion that, first of all, we are uncivilized. And what the Gradual Civilization Act did was it made assimilation the goal. So in other words, you have this definition of Indians and Indian lands and status coming to bear, and now they want to take that away. And enfranchisement becomes a part of that, so that, as Indians, if we get sufficiently educated and deemed to be more civilized, we can give up this status and become assimilated and become brown Canadians and, be like them. And so the next one that was important was in 1860, the Indian Lands Act. And this is really important for us because that's where the British Crown transfers jurisdiction for Indians and Indian lands to the colonies, in other words, to the colonial government. It also created what was then called the Chief Superintendent of Indian Affairs. And it took away the power of our peoples to maintain self-government. So that's where they started to impose their power and take away our powers. And in 1860, you have the Indian, that's what I just went through. And then in 1867, you have Confederation and the British North America Act of 1867. And what the British North America Act does with the inclusion of Section 9124, which is the Indian Act, was it takes jurisdiction over Indians and Indian lands and lands reserved for Indians. And that Indian Act is still in place today. So in 1869, you have the Gradual Enfranchisement Act, and that what's important about that act is it established the band council system. Okay, next slide, Yuma. And in 1876, what government did was they took all those pre-Confederation colonial policies along with the new Confederation policies, and they consolidated them all, stapled them together, and that became the Indian Act that we have today. And it's important when we teach our people this, that they learn and understand that all of this was done to push us out of the way of settlement and colonization, to push us out of the way so Canada, as we know it, can assume jurisdiction as it has, and so that it could assert and exercise its political power and its economy. So what our people are shocked to learn from this is that as a result of the Indian Act, we're now become wards of the Crown. And when we're engaging our people in the community, I always ask them, do you know what this means and how this comes about? And when our people realize that as a ward of the Crown, what that means is that we are either an orphan and or we don't have the legal capacity to make good decisions for ourselves. So the Minister of Indian Affairs does that for us. And as a consequence, we become wards of the Crown. And more importantly, as wards of the Crown, we also don't have legal status and capacity. And that's shocking to our people. And they realize that not only are we wards of the Crown, but we don't have legal status and capacity as a natural person. And when we teach them the definition of a natural person, which is a living human being, they are even more shocked that they never knew what this meant before. But the Indian Act, there was central control over our identity as a people and our lands. Reserve lands were not owned by our people. The Minister of Indian Affairs retains authority over all activities on the reserves, and band councils are established with limited delegated jurisdictional powers, status, and capacity. Okay? And the residential school was a part of a systemic policy by the Canadian government to eliminate the distinct cultures and languages of Indigenous people. In fact, when you go back on the historical record, you follow the policy thread. The discussion which led to this was the fact that this was taken too long to deal with us because we're still talking about our rights. We're still talking about who we are as a people. We're still talking about our responsibilities and obligations. And so the Canadian government decided that we need to take that ability to talk away. In other words, we need to kill the language. We need to kill the history. We need to kill the culture. We need to kill the tradition and the identity overall. So the residential school system was designed and established to do that. We still kept talking. And in 1884 and 1885, the potlatch and the Sundance ceremonies were outlawed, and ceremonial objects were confiscated, and practice in our own culture became a criminal offense. In fact, in British Columbia, as a part of our evidence going into the courts, we told the court that we continued to conduct potlatches. And many, many of our hereditary chiefs and people were imprisoned as a result of that. up and down the west coast of British Columbia and into the interior and right across this country that we know as ours. And so they outlawed our governments, they outlawed our ceremonies, and they imposed their own on us. And we still kept talking. And in 1885, they attempted to stop that by putting a pass system in place, so that if I wanted to visit my relatives in our next village, I had to get the permission of the Indian agent. And when I did get that permission, I could only be gone for a certain length of time. And if I overstayed that time, then I would lose Indian status and not be allowed to come back. In fact, that system stayed in place right throughout the First and Second World Wars. And many of our veterans who went and fought in those wars, as a result of the pass system, came back with no status and not allowed back into our communities. We kept talking. In 1927, the Indian Act was amended, and it became illegal for us to raise money, to hire legal counsel or lawyers to fight for the recognition of our rights and title to our land and as a people. And in British Columbia, the very first organization was set up was the Native Brotherhood. And to this day, they still open their meetings by singing this hymn, Onward Christian Soldiers, because that's what they did to conduct their meetings in the community. Was they held them in a church. They had their watchmen outside. And if the priest, the police, or the Indian agent came, they would alert the people inside, and they would start to sing this hymn. So when our people learn this, they're just shocked, as I said earlier. Okay, zoom in. So as a part of the research project I mentioned earlier, referencing John Burroughs, we always said that the Indian Act never worked for us. And that's our political rhetoric. It still goes on to this day. So when I was putting this research project together in 2007, 2008, I wanted to answer that question with empirical research. So what we did was we commissioned Francis Abel from the Carleton University to do a systems analysis of the Indian Act. And what we were looking for was to answer the question of whether or not the Indian Act can work for us as a government, as people were saying. Her conclusion from her research was that the people who live under the Indian Act in Canada live in unique circumstances. There are no other citizens of Canada whom a specific piece of federal legislation regulates their social and political citizenship and the most fundamental features of their social and economic lives. No other groups of people except those who are in prisons live so thoroughly under the supervision and control of the executive branch of the federal government. No other groups of people except those who are in prisons. When our people first hear that and see that, their hands go to their faces because they just can't believe that this was willfully done. And it's shocking to them. So through this research, we were able to show, yes, it is true that this Indian Act can't work for us to be healthy and free and successful because it wasn't designed to be that. And this is where our people first learn that the Indian Act was designed to take us off the land, to oppress us as a people, and to continue to suppress us as a people. Okay, next slide, Zuma. And we need to educate our people about the Indian Act. Everywhere I go, I always ask the question, so who's read the Indian Act? And at most, I think there's been 6 hands that have been raised. Some of them kind of go halfway up because they read 1 or 2 bits of it. But for the most part, our people haven't read it, don't know it, and don't understand it. And yet, the Indian Act is referred to as cradle to grave legislation. In other words, it controls every aspect of our lives from the time we are born to the time that we die. And I think that it's incumbent on us to teach our people about this reality. Otherwise, it's impossible to get a consensus decision for change. So what we've basically done here to educate our people, to create this understanding, is to analyze the Indian Act. And we've broken it down into 9 component parts. Basically, these are the things that it does. First of all, it's about, number 1, the eligibility of Aboriginal peoples and the management of banned lists. And the Minister of Indian Affairs and that bureaucracy keeps fierce control over this, because this determines the transfer arrangement and how much money flows into our communities. And so the notion of status Indian, who is and who isn't, they maintain that total control. We can have our own membership lists, but it's Indian Affairs who controls who is a status Indian and who isn't. And the control of money is associated with how many status Indians there are. So they control our identity as a people. The second part of the Indian Act is about the management of reserve lands. And this is where our people learn for the first time that their home, that the land that their home is on does not belong to them. And they just are horrified by that. They can't believe that. But then they realize the truth of the matter because it's written right into the Indian Act, and we show them the language. The third part of the Indian Act is just back up to management of reserve lands. You can't do anything with it unless you get the permission of the Minister of Indian Affairs. And that permission can take as long as 5 years. And there has been movement to change that with other institutions, I guess, to make it easier to do. But essentially, the Indian Act is there to control and own the reserve lands. The third part of the Indian Act is surrender of lands. And that just outlines how that can be done, but more importantly, the fact that government can come and expropriate at any time that it wishes to. And we all have that experience across the country, where when we were first put on reserves, many reserves across the country had their lands expropriated, and have been fighting to this day to try to bring those back. But the point is that the government exercises that much control that they can expropriate, in other words, take away at any time. The fourth part of the Indian Act is wills and estates. And this is where we teach people, we ask, who's got a will? And some people raise their hand, and I asked, did you have the Minister of Indian Affairs stamp his approval on that will? Because if you don't have that, that will is of no force and effect. And people are, of course, shocked to learn that as well. But that's a fact. You know that, and this is where the notion of cradle to grave legislation really shows itself, that even when you die, the Minister of Indian Affairs controls. And so the fifth area is management of banned monies. Our people have no idea that the Minister of Indian Affairs in Ottawa, that every band there has a trust account. There's a trust account and a capital account of monies that belong to them. And they learn for the first time that in order to use those monies, that they have to get the permission of Indian Affairs to do so. And we teach them about the fact that even though you could have 100% of the people agreeing to this, that the Minister of Indian Affairs can say no, and they have done so. The sixth part of this is about elections. And in this, we teach the people that, again, the minister controls this to the point where the minister can call an election anytime that it wants. Our people are been conditioned and learned this notion of quorum. So if we have a 9-member elected chief and council, then 5 is quorum. And if you look at the Indian Act, the minister can set quorum at any number they desire for their purposes. And people are also kind of horrified to learn that, that level of control. And then we look at the limited powers of chief and council, that you have bylaw making authority. And we teach people what bylaw means. It's putting in place a law by somebody else's jurisdiction, a bylaw. So we're putting in place a bylaw under the Indian Act, which is Canada's jurisdiction. And the Indian Act sets out different areas where we can do so. And ultimately, we make a proposal to put a bylaw in place. And it's not that the minister approves it. It's the fact that the minister doesn't disapprove it within 40 days, then the bylaw comes into force and effect. And basically it's about dogs and noxious weeds. So every place I go has a dog bylaw, and they have no ability to implement or to enforce it. And it's a bit of a joke when we deal with this in the communities, but it ceases to be a joke when people realize how powerless we are under the Indian Act. The most shocking thing is number 8, which is legal rights and status. To learn that not only that we are wards of the Crown, but that we don't have legal status and capacity as a natural person because we are wards. And that fact applies to both us as people, Indians under the Indian Act, and to our band councils, who have no legal status and capacity either. And so that's why when we try to do something, we have to create corporations under the Canada Corporations Act, or societies under the Provincial Societies Act to deal with matters of importance to us. We can't enter into those arrangements unless we create these other entities to do so. But it's maddening and it angers our people that when they learn this, because it brings into question our citizenship in Canada, and our people begin to wonder, are we even citizens of Canada? Number 9 is education in schools. And what we do there is to teach people that this is what Canada used through the Department of Indian Affairs to seize and take away our children from their parents and their aunties and uncles and their grandparents and the community. And that the language that was used to do so was just only amended like in 2014, which is just a few short years ago. But the fact is that Indian Affairs still controls and has power as far as education and schools are concerned on the reserve. And then, of course, we've got to deal with the province on the other hand. Next slide, please. Zoom off, you back up. Sorry about this. So when we take them through this whole Indian Act thing, we go back to the facilitation, and we use the 5 pillars of the inherent right. You don't have to go back, you can just stay there. We use the 5 pillars of the inherent right, and we'll say, okay, now, having learned about the origin and content of the Indian Act, which is the history of your inherent right in Canada, who are you as a people now? And the spirit goes out of the room and the people stand up and they say, now we're wards of the crown. Now we don't have legal status and capacity as a natural person. Now we've lost our language. Now we've lost our spirituality. Now we've lost our traditions and our ceremonies and our culture and our oral histories and our creation stories. And it goes on. Now, what about our lands? Now we live on reserves that we don't even own. We don't have access to our territories as we once did. We can't fulfill our responsibilities and obligations that we've inherited and that we need to pass on. And now what about jurisdiction and laws? Now we've lost our jurisdiction and we have limited bylaw making power, and we're helpless and hopeless under the Indian Act. Now what about governance? They've outlawed our own governments and they've imposed the Indian Act on us and the Band Council. And we don't have any jurisdiction at all. Now what about resources as a people? They realize that in a lot of the places, the only job is at the band office. And that our young people who are sent away to be educated come back and there's nothing for them. So we're not utilizing our people the way we once did. And as far as the resources of our territories are concerned, it's been made illegal for us to go there and to use them. And our economy has been taken away and destroyed as a result of this. So it's a very, very bleak picture that emerges. And people are really down, and I always promise them, I said, you know, when you come back, I'm gonna bring you back up, I'm gonna lift your spirit. And that's what I hope to do with this next part. You want to take the next slide, please? Now we're gonna talk about our historical struggle for recognition of Aboriginal and treaty rights across the country. And everybody has somebody in their family who was a leader in this regard. Everybody has a legacy of resistance. And we'll talk about what we tried to do. You know, we tried direct action on the land, we tried negotiations, we tried the political route, you know, we tried the international route. And ultimately, we were forced into their courts. And so what I want to take you through now is just a short history of the fact that we've achieved recognition of our inherent right to self-government. Now, what do we need to do to implement it? We changed the law and the Constitution. And what's the impact on our inherent right to self-government? Okay, Zuma? So first of all, it's important to begin in 1982 with the repatriation of the Constitution Act and the inclusion of Section 35 in the Constitution Act. This was brought about by our own leadership. And politically, we fought against and amongst ourselves over whether this was right or wrong. And ultimately, we got Section 35 into the Constitution Act in 1982. And Section 35(1) says that the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. The problem we had at the outset here was that the interpretation of those words, the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights, by Canada and the provinces, was that there weren't any more existing Aboriginal and treaty rights, that they had all been extinguished. So when Section 35 came into the Constitution in 1982, it was referred to as an empty box of rights. So I'm going to show you how we filled it up. Next slide, please. The first case, as I mentioned, I worked on Delgamuukw-Gisdayway for 24 years. And as I mentioned, we came out of the Supreme Court of Canada December the 11th, 1997. For the first time, we defined the nature and content of Aboriginal title, and that it was a legal right to the land itself. And for the first time, oral histories were admissible as evidence, as valid as anybody else's history in the world. And we achieved the first recognition and protection of Section 35 rights. And also that Aboriginal title implies a right to self-government. And our case also laid out the legal foundations for consultation and accommodation. In other words, if the Crown is going to come onto your territories and to attempt to use it in any way or another, that they first of all have to deal with you. And in our case, the court said that consultation and accommodation swung from, on one hand, mere consultation and accommodation, to the other hand, full consent. The problem with Delgamuukw-Gisdayway was that we couldn't achieve the declaration that we were seeking because Chief Justice McEachran, as he then was, for the Supreme Court of British Columbia, so badly mishandled our evidence. In fact, he denied it. And the Supreme Court of Canada slapped his hands for that. But because of it, the Supreme Court can only deal with law. They can't deal with the evidence. So they ordered a retrial, but also strongly urged Canada to negotiate with us. In fact, the last sentence of the decision was that we are all here to stay. And of course, neither Canada nor British Columbia dealt with us like that. They continued to carry on business as usual, notwithstanding we changed the law and the Constitution. And in 2000, in British Columbia, the Campbell case came into being, and that was now former Premier Campbell, Gordon Campbell. He was in opposition at the time that the Nisga'a Treaty came into effect. And in the Nisga'a Treaty, their governance was recognized and affirmed under Section 35. Gordon Campbell argued that the Nisga'a governance provisions were unconstitutional. He said that there is no more room in the Constitution for any other jurisdiction, that it's all taken up by the provinces and by the federal government. And so he said it was unconstitutional. But what the Supreme Court of British Columbia came back and said is that, no, you're wrong. Self-government is now a constitutionally protected right under Section 35. And the court said that Aboriginal title in its full form also includes the right for us to make those political decisions and to have that body to do so. And that was inherent. And so from that, what we get is that there's no need to negotiate agreements around self-government with the provinces or Canada. We have that right. It's an inherent right, and it's up to us to do that for ourselves. Okay, next. So that was a major decision in terms of Campbell, because it clearly says that the inherent right to self-government is a part of Section 35. And then in 2004, the Haida Nation brought a case because out of Delgamuukw-Gisdayway, the Supreme Court said to Canada and British Columbia, you've got to consult and accommodate these people. Canada and British Columbia's response was, we don't have to do this because they haven't proven title. So Haida challenged. And what Haida won was that there is a legally and constitutionally enforceable obligation that arises before title and rights are proven in a court. In other words, the Supreme Court agreed with the Haida and said that if a nation is trying to deal with their title and rights, that the Crown can't just cavalierly run roughshod over it. In other words, you have to deal with it fairly and properly. And it must be done in a way to effect reconciliation between the Crown and Aboriginal peoples. And the court referred to this as a reconciliation between the pre-existent sovereignty of First Nations and the assumed sovereignty of the Crown. And that it must occur at the strategic level of government. And that's really an important part, because what is the strategic level of government? Here we were dealing with a forest case. So from the province's perspective, the strategic level of government was, first of all, land use planning. Secondly, it's land use decisions. Thirdly, it's putting your laws in place, which in this case is the BC Forest Act. And then you let the opportunities. So from our perspective, we have to do our own land use planning. We got to make our decisions. And we have to put our laws in place similarly to be able to engage the Crown at that strategic level of government. That's, to me, the most important part of what I'm about. And of course, in 2005, the Mikisew Cree case came along, which is very important. It's a case that arose in Treaty 8 country, Northern Alberta. And what was going on there was Canada gave a permit to a mining company to put in place a winter road for exploration. And the Mikisew Cree challenged that there wasn't proper consultation and accommodation. Canada argued back that we don't have to consult and accommodate you because consultation and accommodation is Aboriginal title law, and this is a treaty case. They further argued that as a result of Treaty 8, that there weren't any rights left for the Mikisew Cree, so we don't have to consult and accommodate. And if there were any residual rights that survived, the fact that they put Wood Buffalo National Park on top of it extinguished all of that. But the Supreme Court came back and said, no, you're wrong. That the Mikisew right to hunt and fish is a comprehensive constitutional right protected under Section 35 of the Constitution Act. And that consultation and accommodation also applies in the treaty context. But more importantly, the court said that the Crown can't use its own legislation to justify infringement. In other words, what that means for us is that we need to have our legislation in place too, because that's the nature of consultation and accommodation. It's between your respective jurisdiction and your laws. Okay, next, Yuma. And ultimately in 2014, we have the historic Chilcotin case, which came out of from the Chilcotin people here in British Columbia. And they won the first declaration of Aboriginal title and rights on the ground, approximately 1,700 square kilometers of land were declared Chilcotin title lands. And what the court said was that regarding Aboriginal title and rights, that there needs to be a culturally sensitive approach. And one thing we argued in our case was that, first of all, our title and rights comes from our own law. And what the Supreme Court did in Chilcotin was they said when it comes to Aboriginal title and rights, there's now a dual perspective. It's no longer just the common law, which is their law. It's also the Aboriginal perspective, which includes our law. And that's really quite amazing to me because I didn't think we'd ever get that far in such a short period of time. The really important part of this case was also how it matches up against federal and provincial jurisdiction. So when the Supreme Court said that Chilcotin title and rights exists, the next question the court had to ask was whether or not Canada, through its legislation and jurisdiction, whether or not that they can regulate Aboriginal title and rights. And the court said, yes, they can, but their legislation has to say so specifically. And we know that there's not one bit of legislation in this country that says anything about it because it's been denied all this time. The next question the court asked is whether or not the Crown can amend its legislation to regulate Aboriginal title and rights. And the court said that yes, it can, but it must do so in light of Section 35 of the Constitution Act and the notion of the honor of the Crown. And the court determined that, well, it can't. So the next big question the court asked was whether or not the province's Forest Act still applies to Chilcotin title lands. So the court looked at the BC Forest Act and said, what's it there for? And at its heart, it's about managing Crown timber. So the court looks at the situation now and says, that's no longer Crown timber. That's now Chilcotin timber. So what happened is that the Forest Act failed. In other words, the Forest Act has no jurisdiction on Chilcotin title lands. So it calls into question the jurisdiction of the province and of Canada. So what happened was that the Supreme Court of Canada says if the Crown, Canada, the provinces, have any pre-existing agreements with First Nations, they should reassess them and bring them into line with Aboriginal title. Otherwise, they can lose the opportunity and or their legislation can fail. Next slide, Zuma. So what we then do is we take them back through this facilitation. Now, who are you as a people? And our people realize that we can rebuild everything about who we are as a people. We can take back our identity and rebuild it. And the most important thing that arises from that is people say we need to educate our young people so that they can be secure in their identity as a people, so that they know their history, that they know their language, they know their culture, they know their traditions. We bring back our ceremonies. We take back our place. And as far as our lands are concerned, both in the Aboriginal title context and the treaty context, we can take back our place on our territories so that we can fulfill our obligations and our responsibilities. And we could use the lands and resources as we've done for thousands of years, to once again take care of our people, their health and well-being, and our communities and our nations, and that we can rebuild our economies. That as far as jurisdiction is concerned, we've regained our jurisdiction. And now we have to work together to put back in place our own laws to once again govern our lands and our peoples. And as far as governance is concerned, our people realize that we can move away from this Indian Act into our own governance. And that's where you begin to see this consensus decision for change emerging from the people. When the people say, we can't sentence another generation under the Indian Act. And we've won this recognition. Let's together move away from there. And let's work our way back to our own place. And as far as resources are concerned, our people realize that we need all of our people. We need to bring our young people home. We need to bring our educated people home. We need to bring our people with experience back that we need. And we need to reconcile amongst one another. We need to recognize and respect one another. And we need to do this based on a common vision for change. We need to do this based on the priorities that are established by the people, the strategic direction that's given, and the mandate that's provided as a result of that. And we need to get on with the job of rebuilding our nations. So that's the work that I've been doing for a long, long time. And at this point in time, we've created a national research project to support rebuilding of our nations through applied research that emerges from the needs of our people, that they identified for themselves and that they prioritize for themselves. In other words, this research is designed to support them from where they want to start. And we have nations across the country who are involved. And our ultimate goal here is at the end of the 6-year project is that if we can consolidate all of the research and the collective experience, we should have effectively created a transition inherent rights governance model that everybody else can use and have the benefit of that research and that experience. So that's what I was looking forward to bringing forward today. And I hope that it made sense to you. I hope that it sparked the spirit inside of you. And I hope that you would take some personal responsibility to teach people, because we need it. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That was a tremendous amount of information that you shared, and I've often seen things done in like a timeline format, but the way that you presented was wonderfully succinct. So I'm just going to keep going. I'm not sure if everybody's still here, but if you are, thanks for sticking around. And if you have to go, absolutely, feel free as well. I know that there's a link to a survey just before you go, but I am going to get to some of the questions now that some people have shared in the feed. As well, if you also have a question, now's the time. You can put it into the chat window and we'll just go through those right now. So the first question comes from Alan Castle, or Alan Castile. Thank you for sharing your work and knowledge with listeners. The racist intent of the Indian Act is well established by the analysis you conduct. Is there a path to have the act declared unconstitutional through the courts? What are your considerations in doing that?
That's a really good question, because that's our dilemma is kind of twofold here. One is, you know, we've established section 35 and we've defined it on the one hand, and on the other hand, we still have section 9124 of the Indian Act, which I say is unconstitutional. But we have this dilemma where, in effect, the Indian Act is protected in this kind of weird way, where if Canada comes forward to say we need to do something with the Indian Act, our leadership's going to say, no, you're not. If we come forward and say we want to do something with the Indian Act, then it's kind of this catch-22. I don't think that you're going to see a challenge like that anytime soon. So the way I approach this is to work under the clouds and begin to organize a new generation of leaders, so that when the time comes, we'll have that leadership capacity across the country to be able to do it. And I don't believe we have that now. You know, when you look at our national institutions and our provincial institutions, our political bodies, they're all based on the Indian Act. So, you know, we need to see change there too.
Brilliant, thanks for that. Next question comes from Adina Young. The current systems we're in now, what things would you say we should consider when we vote in the federal and provincial elections? As transition occurs and the learning of both ways, colonial and traditional, what should individuals consider politically when elections come up?
Well, I think we have to be really disciplined when we make a decision to do this, because we can easily get sidetracked into worrying about somebody else's election and what we should do there, when we should be disciplined about the work that we need to do amongst ourselves. Let's get that work done before we get sidetracked with somebody else's issue. And, you know, they're going to do what they do regardless of who we vote for. We need to do for ourselves here.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So I have another question. I want to give people maybe a couple more minutes to ask any questions in the chat feed. But if I might go out, and one of the things I enjoy the most is getting a chance to obviously spend some time with you, getting to know your work. And I wanted to ask you, so many of our communities are working just like proverbially just to keep the lights on, managing a myriad of challenges within their within the communities. And if you had any advice for like local leadership, so how would you articulate some encouraging words about starting this process to those communities or those leaders in those communities?
I think, thank you. I love that question because it gets right to the heart of this. One thing that we have in common in the communities who we're working with, it's usually young leadership, elected leadership under the Indian Act, who have made a decision and who said, we can't continue to do this to ourselves. And the inherent right belongs to our people, and that's where we got to go. And so I think that's the most important thing there, is our people need to see that happen. And they need to give it up, you know, and to hand that power back to the people. And when the people believe that that's real, what comes out of this is that people say, all this time, I worried about the future of my grandchildren because I just feel like I have no hope, no power. Now, for the first time, I feel I have a sense of hope. And I think if we can give them that, my opinion on that is that hope, if we can give them a sense of hope, that's big medicine, and we can build from there. But the people aren't going to believe it until they see it. So we can't just talk about it. It has to be seen to be done. And the results are amazing. When you see grandmothers and young people standing up together, saying that, we have hope and we feel empowered, and we have a common vision, and we agree on the same priorities, and we can make a decision together. That's, when you think about our history and our traditional systems, what kept it all together? It was held together by our consensus. So I reckon, what I would say to young leaders, go to your people. They're waiting.
Excellent, thank you. And we just had another question come in from Jake Martel, just asking about the role of non-Indigenous allyship, within this framework, or how can they best help?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because we need to realize that there are people who can help us, but we need that help on our terms. There are lots of Canadians who are concerned about the land and the environment and what's going on out there. And when they realize the jurisdiction that we regained and the impact and the effect that can have when you're talking about reconciliation of laws, our laws and provincial and federal laws, and the fact that we come forward with laws that are laden with principles and values based on, our responsibilities and our obligations. And you look at the reconciliation that can occur from that. I think that those Canadians who are concerned about that realize that they need to ally with us if they're to have any hope. So I think we need to look at those things. I think that, as far as, rebuilding our governments and our governing systems, that we're going to need that outside support, because, when you think about being colonized for over 150 years under the Indian Act, much of that's been forgotten, and that turns out to be the truth when we get into the community. So our people have questions about, what's the government? What is governance? What are governance systems? What are institutions? How do we make laws? So we need allies in those areas, but we need to control the process.
Absolutely, thank you for that. Just had a comment come in from Leona. No question, just insurmountable love to yourself, Satsan, for shining lights, taking off the blinders, instilling hope through decolonization of leadership, putting our people first. Time is now to hit the reset button and reorganize ourselves. Thank you for that comment.
Thank you.
I think another comment. Keep note of my email address. This is from Foster. Keep note of my email address if you ever want to talk about strategy in international courts, be nice to have an international land rights decision and or opinions in favor of First Nations. Have the utmost respect for First Nations and some knowledge and ideas about the international courts. Left your email. Thank you very much for that. And just to sort of add to your point, I think, you know, like, yeah, I think we sometimes sort of don't really share the real stories of how things happened. And I think, you know, like in textbooks and in schools, you know, like there's a lot of lies in what is taught basically about the history and how, you know, this land was colonized, and essentially, and that seems to just be like a product of like that imperial knowledge, you know, that it just gets propagated and pushed forward. So I just wanted to thank you again for sharing that. Another question here. First comment, Emma Greenfield says, first off, I was incredibly moved and inspired by your presentation. How do you stay well during your advocacy in these very critical matters? And any advice for youth who might want to be more involved in the same advocacy?
Well, it's interesting, you know, like I stay well in it by giving thanks and gratitude to our people and our elders and our leaders who brought us here, and their vision and courage. And the way I look at it is, you know, I'm just a worker, and I'm carrying on that vision and that they had by trying to implement what we've accomplished. And that's tremendously gratifying and satisfying. I'm really proud of that, you know, and I wake up every day feeling as strong as when I went to sleep, because this is, you know, some people say this is a big problem. And I say, yeah, but it's a problem that we created for ourselves, and it's a good problem to have, and it's up to us to solve it. As far as young people are concerned, we can't do this without them. My experience in the communities that we work in, that there's no gap between the young people and our elders. The gap is in the middle. And we need to find a way to close that gap so that Indian Act leadership and that Indian Act culture of distrust doesn't, that we can break down those doors to bring in our young people in, because they have tremendous experience and knowledge and very, very powerful spirit that's not as burdened as we were. You know, so in a lot of respects, they're much stronger, and we need that strength. And I think the other thing I've learned is that the young people are waiting too. You know, they're waiting. They want to go home. They want to come back. They want to help. So I look at this as, if the babies being born today are the 8th generation now under the Indian Act. So that's one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is the babies who are born today are the 1st generation to be free. Okay? So that's where we got to take our mentality and our consciousness. And when we work in the communities, one of the dilemmas for people is they realize that themselves is that we can't come at this from a colonized mind because it's full of anger. You know, we have to take off this Indian Act hat and put back on our own inherent rights hat. And we've got to move away from that. And in a lot of respects, our young people have already moved far away, and they can help us. So we need to have them there. They've got to be there, a full part of it. And what we're doing, our project is we bring our young people in to help so that we can train them to be leaders, community organizers, facilitators, and we need everybody.
Brilliant, thank you. So, pardon me, just gonna have one last question here, and then I realize we're way over our scheduled time, but the doctrine of discovery predates Canada, but it's still in effect and used. Is there a strategy as to how to get rid of this?
Well, the doctrine of terra nullius went down in Chilcotin, right? The Supreme Court just swept that off the table. And the doctrine of discovery, we have to sweep that off the table. And it's right there. You know, we get that out of our own minds and replace it with our own freedom. That's how we get rid of it. It doesn't matter what they do or not. We have to take up back our own place in more ways than one. But the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius is important in teaching our people, you know, that colonized mind of the colonizers when they so-called discovered us, that we are uncivilized people. And so when people realize that, it's a way to help build and create a consensus decision for change. And if our people don't learn this, they're not going to make that decision. So that's how we deal with it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So I just want to, again, just say, you know, miigwech, miigwech, for your time. And just acknowledge everybody who's still here and who's made comments, sharing their gratitude with Chief Satsan, and again, for your time as well. I really appreciate that, everybody here who made it today and who stuck around. I also, before I hand it back over to Sarah, well, first of all, sorry, did you want to say any last few words?
Yeah, I want to also thank the people who came on. I know it took a lot longer than necessary, but this is not something we can do in a soundbite, you know, and we need to find ways to make the time and to take the necessary time to really go at this. And so it's hard to always try to put something in 40 minutes when you're looking at 200-300 years of what's happened to us. So, but I hope that this will be useful, and I encourage you to use it. And I also really appreciate this opportunity. Thank you all.
Brilliant. And with that, before I hand it back over to you, Sarah, I just wanted to let the room know as well, in another month, we'll have the second of the 4 sessions, and that'll be with Beverly Jacobs. And Beverly Jacobs is PhD, member of the Bear Clan from the Mohawk Nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. She's Associate Dean at the Faculty of Law at the University of Windsor, and she practices law part-time from her home community of 6 Nations of the Grand River Territory. So be sure to make it back for that. And then I'll hand it over to Sarah now. So thank you.
Thank you, Zuma.